Okay, I'll say that I'm a visual artist, although many, many years ago I did actually do environmental science, and I did actually do remote sensing as part of that just before GISs became available, which is kind of funny and makes me feel a bit old. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about a really quite specific little area. I'm going to be talking about on complexity. It's almost like a filling, because a lot of people here will already know what I'm talking about, or at least I'm going to build a picture where you can put in components that you've already kind of intuitively seen in together into a sort of a structure. So here I'm going to be thinking about things that come from my own practice and the questions of what makes good environmental art and what kind of possibilities are there out for change in situations. I'm not going to be talking about waste management or consumption or other issues that are just as important. Just to clarify my position, I call it artifactual constructivism, although other people gave me the name. And what I'm really saying is I do actually believe in a physical reality out there. I'm not a full constructivist perspective, but it is practiced into existence. It is a coming together of how we think as much as the reality of what we're seeing, which I hope to make a little bit more clear. I don't know if anybody has ever judged public amateur environmental art competitions, but there's an awful lot of dolphin art out there. And rather than show some dolphin art, just something about a recipe for bad environmental art. And these are some of the issues that I want to be talking about. More broadly, this is kind of aesthetics of despair, and I've got a kind of concern about that. About I'm not saying the best environmental practitioners do this, but some of this sort of context of the whole of the environmental art movement might be a little bit problematic. Okay, and so some of these things that I find problematic are continually using wilderness arguments from the 1990s. I can still see that in art being practiced today. But the two that I want to bring your attention to are fixed places and stable senses of belonging, and for various reasons I find that problematic. And secondly, in particular for settler cultures like Australia and Canada, there's this kind of idea that we have to return to a pre-settlement condition. And although that's a very worthy kind of goal, it might not actually be achievable. And it comes back to this kind of whole idea of our fall from Eden, that we're in a state of guilt from our fall from this previous condition, and can result in some works that are perhaps backward looking in time, which I find some a little bit problematic. Okay. Oh, I'm getting really thirsty. And one of those things that sort of a lot of it revolves around this idea of a balance of nature. We've actually heard about balance and unbalance today already, of course. And I don't think anybody here would really believe that, that things are going along at the same. We know that we've got a crisis or a number of crises happening. But it's this sort of idea that is held more popularly. They did a survey of university students, and so many of them believe that nature is undisturbed, is constant. When disturbed, it returns back to a constant condition, and constancy in nature is a desired endpoint. The philosophical idea of the balance of nature has been around since the Greeks, and in particular in ecology. There's an American botanist called Frederick Clements in the 1920s. He's the guy that came up or sort of formalised the idea of succession. And you had primary succession, where you started off with rocks, and little bits grew, and little bits grew, and little bits grew, and then you got a forest, or even secondary succession, where you have a fire which almost decimates, but basically plants grow back. So you're not starting with a blank slate. The problem with Clementsian succession, it was viewed as deterministic, an orderly sequence of serial stages that ended up with a climax community. The idea that it was predictable, that every fire would produce the same kind of sequence of development, for example. Oh, I'm so thirsty. Can somebody give me a drink? Yeah, thank you. And so the habitat that you get back, this kind of expression of the balance of nature, is a summation of all these effects that you've got. This is the view of Clements. And the idea that you could always get back to that original condition of climax after a disturbance. Unfortunately, I should say. So if you thought of nature as a system, these are the characteristics that you would have, that they're closed systems, that they're self-regulating. Thank you. Thanks. I dehydrated from the plane. That succession is a fixed, which I've just talked about. Disturbance is exceptional and humans stand outside of nature. Okay, obviously we don't all believe that, and it's a good thing too, because science itself has actually investigated ecosystems in more detail now, and they've discovered that they are complex systems in flux. So it's not just that we humans have disturbed a balance of nature, but there is no balance of nature to get back to. So what we have are not closed systems, but systems that actually have flows coming in and out, which gives lots of problems for trying to measure something if your boundaries aren't fixed. They're not really balanced in a classic sense of having one telos, one area that they're going for, one sort of conclusion. Succession is not fixed. You can get strange things happening because just for one thing, a quantity of seed of a certain plant was available right at the beginning. And it's not quite founder effects, but it's a similar sort of thing, that beginning state with these extra seedlings of one sort of plant will totally alter what's going on and your end point. So almost in effect, these are random sort of conditions happening. That's that, yeah. Okay, so the consequences of that is that, we have in our artistic sort of sense, traditional things of unity, harmony, order and balance, and things that we're taught in art school, or certainly were. And then we have, well, how do we cope with disunity, disharmony, disorder and disbalance? What are we going to do? Is that profoundly going to affect the aesthetics that we're actually trying to talk about? Okay, balance, that one. Right. Okay, this is a work called Touch by Janine Antoni. It's actually a performance piece that's been videoed. You can go to the internet and look at the video. We see a tightrope walker, which is the artist, balancing on a rope that is positioned on the horizon of a Caribbean beach. As she steps she sort of pushes it down onto the horizon. So that's the touching. She struggles to maintain her progress and balance, and eventually she falls off. It took Antoni quite a while to learn how to tightrope. It's actually quite difficult to walk. And in an interview she says, "I started to feel like I'm now getting my balance, and as I was walking I started to notice that it wasn't that I was getting more balanced, but that I was getting more comfortable with being out of balance. I would let the pendulum swing a little bit further, and rather than getting nervous and overcompensating by leaning too much to one side, I would compensate just enough. And I thought, I wish I could do that in my life when things get out of balance." So that's what I'm sort of a more nuanced understanding and thinking about balance. Okay, here we go. Okay, so there's three things that I want to talk about next: complexity theory, resilience thinking, and environmental management. I want to try to see how they're kind of converging upon some of the things that we do as artists. So complexity is the idea that you have a system with distinct parts but that are connected, so they're a complex system. Complex adaptive systems are a subset of that, which are mostly to do with living systems because they have extra abilities to self-organise themselves. That's about the fact that you can reproduce yourself, and non-living things really can't do that in a great way. So there's extra conditions with complex adaptive systems that they can adapt or learn. Homeostasis, which means they try and regulate conditions to suit themselves. So they do try and make order and stability. Spatial and temporal organisation, reproduction, communication, cooperation and specialisation. So these are extra things that come along with something called a complex adaptive system. Okay, it does get fairly heavy. I won't explain all these terms, just to let you know that you can go quite deeply into thinking about it. I'll just explain the first one, or talk about that in terms of connectivity and interdependence, and that should start your brain sort of clicking, because that's lots of what we're talking about in environmental art these days, and certainly in many people's practices. And the last one, the idea of spaces of possibility. To survive and thrive, an entity needs to explore its space of possibilities and generate variety. So of course that kind of links in with artistic practice. Complexity also suggests that the search for a single optimum strategy may be neither possible nor desirable. Any strategy can only be optimum under certain conditions, and when those conditions change, the strategy may no longer be optimal. Okay. Right, one thing that's really big in ecology is this whole idea of the importance of scale effects. And that's basically the size at which you observe things influences the results that you get. And that causes lots of problems for ecologists in the field. I'll give you an example of a beetle. Now, a beetle exists in a certain region, and you can look at its density, how many individuals per kilometre. And then you might look at a little bit smaller in scale, that it likes to occupy shrubby areas. So at a scale a little bit smaller, its distribution is not random in a landscape, it's actually in the shrubby areas. But if you look inside the shrubby areas, it actually feeds on the things in between the shrubs. So what scale you will look at affects how you understand how that little beetle is distributed. That's a sort of a problem that affects their experimental design, but it's also something to keep in mind, the other aspect of it, which is what they call patch dynamics, which is kind of central to landscape ecology, and that's the idea that within a landscape things are not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous. They're actually, a mosaic of different patches of different things happening. And that, some people believe, is what actually makes things appear to be stable. The patchiness in both space and time of favourable physical conditions is what typically limits population growth, and ultimately what produces the various types of population behaviour that we find in nature. The so-called balance of nature is basically a consequence of environmental variability. Populations exhibit the stability they do because conditions change before they can make a dramatic response to them. So we might even be seeing what appears to be balance and fixity to us, either because we're not looking at the appropriate levels of space and time, or because it's inherently the patchiness is affecting what we see. So in the questions of scale, we have the individual in the middle here, and we have the species, community and landscape level. But also note that this system here describes humans as part of the same thing. So we talk about family, neighbourhoods and municipalities. So that scaling factor is also a part of when you join ecological systems with social systems. So they have social ecological systems. So that's from the science point of view. Okay, trying to get to the next one. Right. Okay, the other two important things, one I'll go very quickly with, is uncertainty. That's the idea that there is not knowing uncertainty. Then there is actual uncertainty in the landscape in terms of variability. And then there's ambiguity. And that's because there might be the simultaneous presence of multiple frames of reference of certain phenomena, which is a complicated way of saying that things are overlapping. So you're getting uncertainty because you don't even know what is affecting or causing something. Okay. The really interesting one, though, is resilience. And that's the idea that the capacity of an ecosystem to tolerate disturbance without collapsing. So without changing radically from one state to another, which can be quite destructive. So there's a large area, if you're interested to go and have a look at the Resilience Alliance, and they've had some art exhibitions and environmental projects associated with it. There's been a couple. Okay. To explain that a little bit more sort of graphically, here we have what they call stability surfaces. This little blue dot is in the same position in both of these diagrams. And what they are is a kind of a conceptual measure of stability. So if this blue dot here is anywhere within this catchment, it will fall into the state here. So one state of a lake, say clear with very little algae. But if conditions change, say for example, the conditions change to increase the amount of algae, then the little ball will fall into another state. So that's when they talk about state changes. That's these rapid changes from one state to another. Now that should scare the bejesus out of you, because we might not see things until too late that these changes are going to occur. But on the other hand, it allows you to look at how can you shift the kind of background so the ball can stay in the place that you want to stay perhaps, or shift from a bad state that you don't like to a good state. And that's the concept of transformation. Now, okay, keep going. I'm not even nowhere near where I want to be. Okay, so just to give you an idea, this whole idea of adaptive management cycles, that's a concept that most agricultural systems want you to stay up in the corner there and be stable. But they do catastrophically collapse and regrow again. So don't think of things being stable, think of things going through cycles and being able to change. Very quickly, there's the concept of panarchy, which says that there are nested systems of these adaptive cycles going on. This is an example from the Hunter Valley. But basically, the local system and the larger economic systems, the global economics up the top. Very quickly, the third area is this whole idea of adaptive management, that scientists have got it around their head that they can't have a single management and decide on something and then wait for it to happen. They actually have to go through a process of consulting the community and changing their management sort of as they learn things. And the whole idea of you have to do things even though you don't have enough knowledge of what's going on. So that means you have to keep changing things as you adapt to the circumstances. Right. Okay, extremely fast. So what does complexity and resilience ask of us? We promote and sustain biological and social diversity. We reduce any uncertainty where we can. We expect surprise. We don't expect things to stay the same. We try and look at feedback loops telling us what's going on as quickly as possible so we can respond very, very quickly. Heterogeneity is good. Modularity, that's the idea that within a system, if all the links are really tightly linked together, if you pull it, the whole thing gets pulled like a spider's web. But if you have little systems within them, they don't transmit the same kind of problems across a whole ecosystem. So the idea of getting modular development within a system is more stable. So diversity is good, but modularity is good as well. Okay, so I'll just keep going on. Building trust talks about social and ecological trust. So, of course, we've come across a lot of this before. We know about mindfulness towards the environment, things that artists can do. We know about responsiveness and responsibility and those kind of unique things that happen in environmental art, I guess, compared to painting, abstract paintings. Interrelatedness is a big one, and this is what Sasha Kargan goes on about quite a bit. To find and make connections, to be sensitive to patterns that connect, to be able to see what's going on in ecosystems. And there's this wonderful quote. The system's sensibility will be like that of a musical ear which perceives the competition, symbioses, interferences, overlaps of themes in one same symphonic stream, where the brutal mind will only recognise a single theme surrounded by noise. So if we can latch on to that as artists, that's some of the strengths of what we can do. We are looking for an aesthetic that comes from constant, generative, dynamic and fluctuating conditions of change. Our gaze must be adaptive, fluid and flexible according to appropriate spatio-temporal scales. And that's got from a guy called Jason Simas. Okay, yep. Right, so examples, I'm just going to pull them out. An example of somebody that explores ecological processes rather than focus on a single object. This is the work of Steiner and Lenzinger. They actually create things that combine both synthetic things and natural things, sort of fusing them together and using ammonium nitrate fertilizer to make crystals that could have connected all up, making invisible processes visible. Another one is Radio Animal, or Uncertainty in the City, which is the bigger project that Radio Animal was part of. And that's by Snaesbjørnsdottir and Wilson. This is works that revisit places belonging in flux. They were looking at animals that cross over the boundaries into human homes and human lives in urban areas, and kind of problematizing people who've made friends with squirrels and then the squirrel takes over the house and stuff like that. So they got very interesting stories going with that project. We have Long Player, not an environmental project at all, but thinking about works that link different scales of time and place, the local and the global, the short term and the long term. If anybody knows about this project, it's going to be playing for 1,000 years and it doesn't repeat itself. You can listen to it on the net, you can go and visit various places around the world where you can listen to it. And it's about how to understand deep, long time, and how to look at social structures to keep the project going for 1,000 years. So it combines two really exciting areas. Couldn't go on without mentioning Helen Mayer and Newton Harrison, who've been around for a long, long time. The interesting thing about their project is they're actually creating complex adaptive systems. So I think that's really quite interesting from their approach. I'm going to run through these. As you've seen already from some of the talks, this whole idea of dialogue and exchange and how important that is. We've talked about people already as conversationalists and as catalysts for change, and some of the things that we could possibly do. We've also already discussed thinking across boundaries. And my comment at the beginning about ecology being a great way to look at the environment, but one form of knowledge, and it's not the only form of logic for looking at environments, which is something that Sasha Kargan also picks up again. And it's more than collaboration, so I've been involved with quite a few collaborative things, but I'm interested still with further work in that area. Right, yep, and the last one is we can offer different things. And my project was a spatial sound project using GPS and little notebook computers and spatialising sound and telling stories. Okay.
Thank you very much.